I think we're ready to start. Good evening and welcome to this RIBA Future Architects event, The Barriers in Architecture. Over the next hour and 45 minutes, I hope to explore the barriers within the architectural profession and education itself. My name is Femi Oresanya and I will be your chair this evening. Joining me will be Tumpa, Husna, Yasmin Fellows, Ibrahim Buhari, Cristina Lanz Azcarate, and Paul Karakusevich. They will be offering an insight into what they believe are some of the barriers to studying, qualifying, working, and progressing in architecture. Now, let me start by saying that the architectural profession, my profession, a profession that I love dearly, has, just like society, got problems. The data seems to suggest all this. Findings from the most recent Architects Journal Diversity Survey say that there are obstacles at every level for someone from an ethnic minority to progress in architecture. And what about women in architecture? The gender pay gap is still an issue, even though there has been some improvement in previous years. And I suppose as we're coming out of COVID and everyone has had to undergo a new way of working, a new way of thinking, maybe, just maybe, this profession could be more appealing for women to remain in the profession. And, you know, whilst the profession is trying to be more equitable, more diverse, more inclusive, it is still not representative of the society that it serves. But let's not forget where the RIBA has come from. Since the Institute came into being in 1834 as a men's only institution, it only elected its first non-white president, Sunad Prasad, who was of Indian heritage, in 2007. And then in 2009, 174 years later, we had our first female president. Now, we've had two more female presidents since then. Progress has been made, but it's not happening quickly enough. Now, the thing is, you may find this difficult to believe, but the RIBA believes that every young person who aspires to become an architect, regardless of background, race, gender, faith, sexuality, or disability, should have an equal opportunity to do so and to do well. Because whilst you need to be registered with the Architects Registration Board to call yourself an architect and practice as one, becoming a member of the RIBA is purely by choice. Many of you tuning into this event this evening you are the future, and the RIBA wants and needs you to join the RIBA so that it can grow and continue to protect and enrich and progress the profession. So we must protect the aspiring architects coming through. They must be nurtured, they must be mentored, and not be exploited. So anyway, enough from me. I'm looking forward to listening to what the speakers have to say. Each speaker will be given 15 minutes to put their views across, and afterwards we'll have a question and answer session. Because I really want to allow as much time for the Q&A, I will be keeping our speakers strictly to time. So our first speaker will be Tumpa Husna Yasmin Fellows. Tumpa is an architect, a tutor, a founder of the Fame Collective, and so much more. Over to you, Tumpa.
Thank you, Femi. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak and present the Fame Collective's research at this event. And thank you, Femi, for the introduction. So I'd like to start by sharing my screen. Okay, so I'd like to start by speaking a bit about the Fame Collective and what we do. And So Fame Collective is a research-based network founded to support women of diverse backgrounds and ethnicity. And our current research project is called Exposing the Barriers in Architecture from a Fame's Perspective. So the initial intention for starting Fame Collective is to facilitate a platform to create a space to amplify the quiet voices of female architects of minority ethnic in architecture profession and education. Fame is both an acronym and an ambition, in this case supporting and standing for female architects of minority ethnic backgrounds, but also representing the ambition to shed greater light on ethnic minority women who are truly talented, passionate, and incredible practitioners, educators, critiques, students, and more much more within the expansive field of architecture. Fame Collective has collaborated across a number of institutions since 2020, and we have hosted 3 participatory public events which celebrate the successes of ethnic minority women to inspire the next generation of female architects of minority ethnic. The discussions included how they have navigated and overcome the barriers they faced in architecture profession and education, all of which are documented and available on our website for all to see. Within these events, we also hosted breakout rooms where participants shared experiences of the barriers in architecture education and profession. And our research is explored through extracting the quotations from the participatory sessions and documenting the lived experiences of the barriers. Our current research is titled, as I mentioned earlier, Exposing the Barriers in Architecture from a Fame Perspective. Our participatory research symposia exposed the barriers faced by Fame through narrative of their lived experience of gender and racial discrimination in architecture profession and education. The research is part of Fame Collective's campaign for inclusive architecture practice and education. This research aims to raise awareness of the barriers, inequalities, and lack of diversity in architecture, and to demand change that responds to our collective challenges. Yeah, it's going, okay. So a bit about what we've done so far in our research. So we have submitted 2 research updates, update reports to the RIBA so far, and our first research report highlighted that discrimination in architecture education is evident in the data and the inherent systemic concerns that stand as barriers in architecture and women for underrepresented racialized groups, leading to the feeling that architecture is not for them. The current data is significant and supports the narratives collected from the participants of the Fame Collective's research symposium and our recent survey. The following data highlights that the architecture education system is not working for everyone, and the barriers in architecture education are embedded in the system. The narrative of the lived experiences exposes the discriminatory behaviors and attitudes to those of those who are in power, who prescribe processes that support the current system. The cost of architecture education and the requirements for work experiences can also act as barriers for those from less affluent backgrounds, or for those who do not have network or connections within the profession, all of which are exacerbated for female from ethnic minority backgrounds due to their racial and gender discriminations they face. The graph on the left shows that the graph on the left is the ARB's recent published numbers of architects registered in the registration board, and the graph on the right is the numbers published by the RIBA, which indicate between part 1 and 3, the numbers of students from all ethnic minority background reduces. So a high number of students from ethnic minority background do not complete the chartership or can call themselves architects. So there's a huge dropout rate. And these are numbers that we've analysed from the current ARB registration, and it highlights that the lack of diversity is in the profession. So these are registered architects at the ARB registration. So our last research symposium focused on architecture education, and the first two events focused on the profession. So I'd like to play an extract from the last event, which includes one of our speakers, Marsha Ramproop from the RIBA, and her response to Fame Collective's research.
A part of those who allow these outcomes to transpire, and yet, here it is, the evidence, the outcomes, the impact. And it's beholden upon us all in the profession, the ARB as a statutory organisation and the RIB as a professional body, to work together with all to tackle it. It's all well and good acknowledging and saying, yes, yes, but these figures lay bare the reality in people's lives. And whilst it may feel personal to them when this research is laid at the feet of those in charge, it's not so personal to them. Those in charge can afford to step back, work through any bias, defensiveness and discomfort, and take this data, showing systemic discrimination and the stories of personal woe, and run with it to create change, remembering it is personal for those who are affected.
Yeah, I wanted to share this extract of the video because it's a really powerful way that Marsha has responded to our research. So the last slide before I play another video is our analysis of the issues which were mentioned in our participatory events, which back up the data that we've analysed. So from my analysis of lived experience of the participants, these were identified as issues of barriers in architecture. So race, racism, gender, lack of racial and gender diversity in architecture, class, socioeconomic background, cost of architecture education, narrow structure and framework of architecture curriculum, narrow structure of framework of profession and practice, identity in architecture, Western language and representation of architecture, age, religious belief, ability, lack of access to information, lack of connection, architecture industry impacted by economic activity, structural barrier, and so on and so on. So my last slide is a video which summarizes the student survey produced by Fame Collective volunteers. The video is produced by the Fame Collective volunteers, and the survey, we have circulated a student survey aimed at current and past students in RIBA registered architecture schools in the UK. And the aim was to find out Fame participants' experience in architecture education. So all answers were kept anonymous. The video has been aired in the research symposium held back in October, and the findings of Fame Collective's student survey amplify the voices and the narratives of current and past Fame students of architecture in the UK. So what the students have identified as the barriers in architecture education. So I'm just going to go ahead and play the video.
We have gathered lived experiences of the barriers faced by female architects of minority ethnic while studying architecture in the UK. This video summarizes the results of the surveys that have been completed by Fame students and graduates of a range of universities across England, Wales, and Scotland.
Have you ever experienced barriers, felt uncomfortable, or felt like you didn't belong in your course due to your race or gender?
I've felt bothered by the attitudes of both staff and students towards foreign things, in the way that non-European architecture is taught and received as something different to European architecture, and the different treatment of international students, both patronising and dismissive.
I would say in the overall ratio of racial diversity, Black people were definitely underrepresented, and I felt the ratio of people of colour was drastically lower in my Part 3 course.
I don't really feel comfortable at uni. As a Muslim woman who wears a hijab and a minority at my university, I feel uncomfortable in certain situations where I'm doing group work with students on the minority race or religion. I struggle to express myself at times and be myself.
I had one design tutor who deliberately left me last in class for design tutoring. By then, it was always the end of the morning or afternoon, and therefore not enough time was allocated to me.
Do you have a FAME role model or a FAME mentor to help you in your journey in architecture? What was the gender and racial diversity like of staff and course mates, and did that affect you?
I don't have any architect role models because I can't identify with any architects we see, study, or hear about in the media in terms of race, gender, or even class.
I was fortunate to have a FAME tutor in my final year, and her presence was actually so reassuring. A woman of color who was also someone who raised a family, ran a practice, and was now tutoring too.
I've not met any FAME role models personally in practice, but am becoming more aware of FAME architects through networks such as FAME and webinars attended over this past lockdown year.
The gender of staff had a good balance, however senior staff were mostly male.
I have never had a FAME or even a male BIPOC tutor, which made it uncomfortable when working on design projects because I would feel like I had to adapt my design process to what was expected of me as a minority.
Were there challenging occasions when you wanted to leave architecture and study other degrees? If so, why did you feel this way? What made you change your mind, or how did you overcome the challenges to navigate through in your architecture education?
I found that working in practice is so much more enjoyable, which helped me continue through to qualifying as an architect.
The motivation to push barriers and champion my identity through architecture and be a FAME architect in an attempt to change the architecture field today.
I had such a bad experience. I still haven't returned to architecture after completing my part 2 and haven't completed my part 3.
At that time, I had a really difficult white male tutor who made me feel like crap, and I felt like I could never be an architect as I didn't understand his way of thinking. I'm really glad I didn't quit, as later I had a female tutor who was the best tutor I've ever had and changed my mind about studying architecture. I realized that my experience of the course was so dependent on the people leading the course and what they projected as architecture.
Due to the poor projections for women to progress in the industry, poor pay compared to other industries, requirement for expensive education to qualify, financially it took a lot of commitment and support from my family to reach qualification, as the Part 1 and 2 salaries are very low.
I felt all of my designs were more harshly critiqued due to my beliefs in the importance of community and togetherness, preventing me from creating fantastical architecture.
Were you ever advised against pursuing careers in architecture due to your gender and/or background during school or as university student or graduate?
At my Part 3 oral exam interview, one of the two examiners was a woman, white British, who started the interview by remarking on my appearance. I am of mixed Lebanese, Romanian, Italian ethnicity, instead of focusing on my work. She proceeded to tell me that I was too ambitious, wanting to be a practicing architect, do a PhD, teach, and have hobbies. The message was that you can't have everything if you're a woman. You should give up your career. I cannot imagine anyone ever saying that to a man. Even though she gave me a low mark, my coursework was excellent, so I still got distinction.
I was always encouraged to do pharmacy or optometry, something shorter or more suited for females.
I was told numerous times that I will never become an architect because I'm a woman.
When it comes to design work and showing your work, there are tutors that don't even give you comments sometimes. And I don't think it was because of the quality of my work, but just because of the way I looked, and also because I was interested in traditional mud contradiction methods and I wasn't doing big complex structures.
One of the teachers in my high school, her husband was an architect and she just didn't think it was for me or I was built for it. The comments
We're
were
coming to
quite
the end of your time now.
How can the barriers be challenged?
If you
Or
can
how
wind it
can the
up.
educators address the barriers and support
Nearly
FAME
done.
students in architectural education?
Become well informed on their struggles, backgrounds, and identities. There is an ignorant nature towards the specific barriers that FAME individuals face that tutors fail to address because they haven't put in the effort to learn about it.
Carrying out lectures built within the course and outside, surrounding the topics of gender, racial diversity, and architecture.
They need to start actively giving examples and case studies done by female architects, LGBTQ architects, architects from different cultural backgrounds, so students other than the white straight ones can have examples of hope and success, as their experience and journey will be much harder and different to theirs.
Just give us the same opportunities and faith you have in your other students.
Ensure FAME are well represented in all modules and staff, including external tutors and critics. Reach out to students and provide a suitable support network if they need. Include in the curriculum for students to run school engagement events to encourage more students and young people from diverse backgrounds to study architecture.
As a student or practitioner, what message
Yeah,
would you give
Tumpa, we're going to have to end this now.
Okay,
or thinking
all
about
right.
architecture?
I'm sure
Yeah,
that others will be able to, if they want to see the last few slides, they can go onto your website. Thank
yeah,
you.
no,
If anyone
that's
has
fine.
questions for Tumpa, put them in the chat and we'll try and pick those ones up later on. Thank you very much for your presentation, Tumpa.
Thank
The
you.
next speaker is Ibrahim Buhari, an architect and urban design officer at the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. He is also a member of RIBA's Architects for Change, the expert advisory group that is advising the RIBA on addressing issues of equity, diversity and inclusion in our profession. Over to you, Ibrahim.
Thank you for that introduction, Femi, and hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you. So in terms of my presentation structure, I'll give a brief introduction into who I am, speak a bit about my academic and professional background, and then about what I do outside of professional practice. Then I'll go into discussing barriers in architecture and speak briefly about why representation matters. So I'm Ibrahim Buhari. I'm an architect and senior urban design officer at RBKC. Some of the other hats that I wear, I'll talk about in the next slide. So the first thing I'll do is speak a bit about my academic and professional background and speak a bit about my journey and some of the barriers I've faced. I like to share this slide because I feel it's something that's relatable to students who might be on the call and also to professionals. So my journey started at A-level in 2002, where I didn't know what I wanted to study, well, what I wanted to pursue as a career, but I knew I wanted to do something creative. I followed A-levels by doing a foundation at Central St. Martin's to kind of figure out exactly what it was I wanted to do. I did a module in the foundation, which was spatial design, and that kind of clicked. And from there, I decided I wanted to pursue a career in architecture. So in 2005, I joined Kingston University for my undergraduate. And in a year of about 150 students, only about 10 were Black. And by the end of the degree course, that was half to about 5. When I graduated in 2008, I graduated at the start of the recession, and all my contemporaries were struggling to find work. I managed to find work at a one-man band set up by a guy who had also been recently made redundant from his practice. And I managed to get, I think, about 6 months of experience from that before I began my part 2 at University of East London in 2009. That seemed to have a much more diverse cohort of students. And when I finished the part 2 in 2011, the recession was still prevalent. And again, I struggled to find part 2 experience. So I ended up doing a lot of part-time work in retail to keep kind of an income coming in whilst looking for work. I managed to find a part 2 placement with Ash Secular Architects in 2012, and they kept me on for a year before they had to let me go again because of financial reasons and the recession. But they were able to recommend me to a practice called Borough Fisher, which I joined in 2013. And I ended up staying there for 6 years. I did my part 3 there, returning back to Kingston University. And it was a great place for me to kind of grow and develop as an architect. I managed to deliver a number of projects. And in 2019, I left the private sector to join public practice as an associate, and they placed me in my current role as a senior urban design officer at the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. A few of the other hats that I wear outside of the profession, so as Femi's already mentioned, I'm a member of the RIBA Architects for Change expert advisory group on equality, diversity and inclusion. I am a director trustee at Build Studios. They're an organization which champions diversity and do a lot of outreach work to schools, encouraging careers in the built environment. And they also have subsidized rates for what do you call it, for workplace facilities. I've also been a mentor at Blueprint for All, formerly known as the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust. I'm a mentor at the University of East London's Centre for Student Success Programme. I'm a member and ambassador of the Paradigm Network, and I am a Part 3 professional examiner at the Bartlett School of Architecture. So the barriers in architecture, for me, they can be kind of categorized into three distinct sections. The first is entry into the profession, and that usually involves kind of the intake into the architectural education, intake into practice, and then also getting those crucial part 1 and part 2 placements. The second section is retention. So whilst kind of in practice and you've got your foot in the door, it's about whether people are able to thrive in practice, whether they choose to stay within practice and in the built environment sector, and whether they choose to complete the qualification and do their part 3, which Tumpa talked about in her presentation earlier. And then the final section is progression. So are people able to advance within practice, professional practice? And then also the lack of Black and minority-led practices that we know are prevalent through a lot of the data that Tumpa also shared. And then also, of those Black and minority-led practices, do they have access to public capital projects, which is another big issue. A lot of the work I've been doing personally outside of professional practice is kind of focused at that first group to do with entry. So looking at specifically what the barriers are to entry, again, I've kind of highlighted 3 main barriers, which are socioeconomic barriers, cost, and representation. So the first, speaking about socioeconomic barriers, socioeconomic barriers are income. People might have caring responsibilities that impacts on their time, social status, educational background. So if somebody's in a family where they're the first person to go to university, that's a major thing. Occupational background, again, if somebody's in a family where nobody's ever been an architect or pursued a profession, that can be a barrier. And then costs is a major barrier. So when I was studying architecture, the fees were around £3,000 a year. They're currently about £9,000 a year. Obviously, the cost of field trips is a major point as well, depending on where the field trips are. Cost of IT and hardware and software, resources, books, and the cost of equipment. And then the last section I'm highlighting is representation. So that's obviously representation within the profession. So you know, how many ethnic minorities are in those leadership positions? How many ethnic minority colleagues do we have? Representation amongst teaching staff, representation amongst guest critics, and of course, representation within the curriculum, which is a big topic at the moment. And there are some schools of architecture doing work around decolonizing the curriculum. So in terms of how some of these barriers are being tackled, looking at specifically at tackling socioeconomic barriers and cost, recently the London School of Architecture have launched a new bursary scheme, and that's aimed at low-income households. The programme aims to fully fund fees for a maintenance bursary at the LSA's Part 2 scheme, Part 2 course. And the value of the awards is a total of £36,000 per student, and that's over a 2-year programme. Blueprint for All, formerly the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, they run a bursary scheme every year, and that's basically raised from a fundraised pot of money that happens every year, and it's able to give a small number of students the financial need they need to pursue their architectural studies and the support. And the RIBA have a number of bursaries also available, including the ones I've listed here. So there's a Part 1 bursary, which is for £6,000. There's a Part 2 one for the same amount. There's a John David and Herbert bursary for £6,000. There's a student support fund for £3,000. There's an ARH scholarship for £6,000. And there's a Rent Insurance Association scholarship for £6,000. There are also a few travelling bursaries, which I haven't mentioned on this list. The other thing I've missed out that's not on this slide is the Architects Apprenticeship Scheme that the RIBA are running as well. So that gives students the opportunity to earn while they're learning and kind of working within practice. So why does representation matter? If we look at the statistics, looking at the 2011 census, 13.3% of Londoners identify as Black. We don't have the results of the 2001 census, which will be released later this year, I think in May. We know that 1.2% of architects in the UK identified as Black in 2008. And we know that 0.9% of architects in the UK were identified as Black in 2012. So there's a clear disparity looking at those figures. And obviously we know that several barriers into entry and progression sadly remain in our profession, and it acutely impacts the diversity of the profession. And I've highlighted just 4 key reasons why representation matters. So the first is that we cannot fully understand and appreciate and design for the diverse communities if we do not employ a diverse workforce, which is, simple as that, really. It's quite a clear and easy message to understand. Looking at the next 3 reasons, the reasons that follow speak a bit about the more kind of business-minded and economic reasons why representation matters, because often we hear about the more emotive reasons. So, second point, representation within the built environment can result in greater stakeholder buy-in when engaging with diverse communities. So I've seen this a lot in my role in RBKC, in that when architects or design teams are engaging with communities to try to redevelop or bring about change in a certain community, there's always an element of distrust, and having somebody amongst the design team who looks like you and maybe possibly might have similar kind of experiences to you is a good way to build trust. The third reason, a diverse workforce increases creativity, productivity, and problem solving amongst companies. And the last reason, a diverse workforce increases profitability. So for those last 2 reasons, there's a lot of data that suggests those 2 last points that I've just said, and they are kind of not the usual emotive reasons that you normally get when speaking about why representation matters.
2-minute warning.
That's the end of my presentation.
Oh, perfect. That's great presentation, Ibrahim. Thank you very much, and
thank you.
Within time as well. Our next speaker is Cristina Lanz Azcarate. Cristina is an architect a director and co-founder of Atelier EURA. She's also chair of the National Association of Women in Construction and also a member of the RIBA's Architects for Change group. Over to you, Cristina.
Okay, this is my presentation. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. I will just explain quickly that in preparing this presentation, what I have tried to do is think about barriers I have encountered throughout my career and give you some tips on, or kind of hints on how I have addressed them and how you could be addressing them. And I think the reason is likely because I have been speaking about increasing diversity in the construction industry for too many years, and I feel that offering some ideas might be a positive way to go about it. So, okay, with this in mind, I will start. Okay, I was 14 when I decided to become an architect, and it would be dishonest if I said I have never questioned my decision. Being an architect feels nothing like what I imagined it to be, even while I was at university. On the one hand, our work can be exciting, collaborative, and even political, which is thrilling. On the other, it can also be removed from the design, repetitive, and even frustrating. This is because the success of the projects we help to shape is measured less in our design skills and more in the way they address the needs of those who will inhabit them. And given that humans are complex, so are projects. And to solve complex challenges, there is nothing better than a growth mindset, the kind of inquisitive, ever-expanding one that flourishes when working in a diverse environment. So lack of diversity as the starting point of our conversation. Prior to setting up my own architectural studio, Atelier EURA, which in case you wonder comes from Eurasia because I am European and my husband is Japanese. I worked in regeneration roughly for 10 years. In that context, I quickly became aware of the advantages to be found in building a team where individuals holding a range of views and experiences complemented rather than replicated one another. In order to work successfully with each other, these type of groups seem to adopt open lines of communication, a shared sense of purpose, and mutual respect from day one. They had to find a way to work with each other. And the backgrounds and uniqueness of each of the individuals acted as a leveling factor where everyone's experience was valuable. Asking questions and owning up to mistakes was encouraged and assimilated as part of the process. And all the viewpoints we heard were heard to make sure solutions were both robust and considered. When it came to community engagement, this approach helped us especially because we could reach out to local stakeholders who, in seeing us, felt comfortable opening up and adding value to the project. However, despite the many benefits I could find, I also found that many people around us, even within the office, saw this as too much of an effort when compared to recruiting people who look like them, shared similar backgrounds, and got them. I doubt that they even realized how this was impacting those of us who were different and those applying for work. However, it does remind me of the start of my journey. I want to talk next about social capital as a barrier. Social capital, when I first decided to become an architect, my mom was not sure. She worked as a secretary for the communications company of Spain, and as part of her role, she had to deal with contractors on a regular basis. Mom worried that an introvert who doesn't shout would not be able to communicate with the site and to get them on board. In case you wonder, I found humor did help. But mostly she worried that nobody in our circle was an architect, and since it was a profession reliant on contacts, I would be on my own and potentially struggle to take off. Many years later, having moved to the UK on my own, I must be honest and say that she was right to highlight this to me. Social capital can be the determining factor to help you progress in your career, and today I want to share how I built mine in order to create a new role at a point of my career when I got stuck. After many years feeling undervalued and unable to move on due to personal circumstances, in March 2013, I took a day off to attend a conference organized by the National Association of Women in Construction, which was chaired by a former colleague. At the conference, I met women of all kinds of from all kinds of jobs, working at senior level within the built environment, and talking to them made me realize how valuable it was for me to be there. I had never considered joining a network, but this one was amazing. A few months later, I became the regional chair, and very quickly, I was connected to women who were at the top of some of the country's largest construction companies, as well as top house builders, developers, and a lot more. My volunteering, which took place out of hours, helped me grow my network exponentially and build my confidence. I was invited to contribute to a paper by the Smith Institute, launched in Parliament by an MP, a day-long conferences by the organized by different institutes, even the FT, and to roundtables organized by the industry press. After a year doing this, I used this social capital I had been gaining, completely unsupported by my company, as a bargaining chip when negotiating a promotion and a pay rise, which I got, by the way. So from all this experience, I would like to share with you that if I were you, and if I was my younger self, I would join as many professional networks as your time allows, so that you have access to people at different levels within the profession and beyond. I would attend industry events, many of which are free and available to you as students. I would also connect with the rest of the industry and beyond. You never know where your job is going to be coming from. I mean, Ibrahim explains that sometimes, depending on the economical circumstances, you might need to look beyond the obvious to find jobs. And also, I would like to suggest that you find a mentor. At that very first conference, I was introduced to Fluid Mentoring, where I have been volunteering since 2013. And I would recommend it to you as well. However, even if you do your best, sometimes there is something beyond your control that is stopping your progression. And so it is important that when you go into a company, you are very aware of the office culture. The wider construction industry, and architecture in particular, have a culture of long hours and uninterrupted availability, which historically has been the way in to be promoted and developed within your role. However, as the workforce now includes a wider range of individuals who want to thrive but would not want to disregard their responsibilities beyond the office, finding out about the culture of the place prior to applying to a job is something that I would advise you to do as well. It would most definitely have saved me a lot of headache. Over the years, I have found the following questions could be useful for you. Is the recruitment process transparent? How open is the leadership? Do they discuss what is happening in the company so that you can be up to speed and prepared for any changes? Is there a clear role pay structure within the company? Do they have a high or low staff turnover? What are the company values? Also, are they a dynamic, people-centric, process-orientated, or result-orientated company? None of this is the exact perfect answer. They all depend on your preferences. Are there groups within the company that they are focused on specific topics that you might be interested in, in pursuing? Investing the time in understanding the culture of a place is something that will definitely help you make the right decision. Now, I want to talk about the next topic, which is the linear path illusion. So again, Ibrahim touched on this slightly. This is what we are supposed to be following. However, life is not linear, and therefore this setup often makes us think that it is, and that if it isn't, our life should be shaped so that it was. this is not only quite limiting for anyone who needs to work flexibly and has familial aspirations, but it has a direct impact on the diversity within the profession. I often meet graduates who are unaware of the many opportunities the wider construction industry has to offer to architects, and always seem surprised to know that the many roles. I have to say that those roles are often better paid and have better hours than architectural studio-based ones. So those roles could be found either client or contractor side. I will briefly share my career path for full disclosure. So you can see here, just quickly, I came from Spain, where I studied architecture. In Spain, you just study architecture. It's not about part one, break, etc. Then I had to sit in a panel of RIBA to validate that my 5 years of architecture in Spain were equivalent of 2 years part one. And I was told I had to study part two fully. So like Ibrahim said, I got myself some work when I was studying, and I worked both as a designer, but my pay was very little. So I also worked in a toy shop and in a restaurant. My next jobs, you can see them in the presentation. And then I started growing in my roles, and really took a very long time to do my part three. But the actual real change that happened was nothing to do with part three. It was actually what I just described about getting involved with volunteering, starting my studio, and opening up to other wider variety of opportunities. Because the reality is that the role of the architect is evolving with time, and we don't know what it's going to become. So therefore, having a bigger picture can be helpful. Having worked client and contractor side gave me the access to first-hand exposure to very different points of view and an understanding of the challenges they face, but also the expectations and preconceptions they have when it comes to working with architects. Think how valuable this is. So when you are looking at your career, don't be discouraged. Think about it as a long-term project, and imagine each one of your experiences as a piece of a bigger puzzle that you are working on. This will help you stay more focused on growing your skills rather than the ultimate goal, and will prevent you from getting discouraged, which is quite normal. Then also consider lesser known paths. For example, allow me to share some of the alternative paths that they are available for you. In orange, those that they are contractor side. In blue, those that they are client side. And as you can see, some contractors are, and I know this firsthand because I know people who have done this, have in-house architectural teams that they support you to get the training for your part three. So don't be discouraged. As I said, open your mind and try to see beyond the obvious. And also take inspiration from other industries to create opportunities. Sometimes the roles that we want to do don't exist, but we can acquire some skills to help us get there. So finally, I want to talk about the language barrier, but not as it may be, it might sound obvious to you listening to me, because after all, this is kind of my family language tree. So I am thinking more about the way architects talk to the rest of the industry. So the reason why I'm explaining this to you is because when we are, during the years we spent at university, we are encouraged to use a language that is academic and technical. And this is a language that is intended to communicate between ourselves, i.e. with your peers. Now, this should not be underestimated because companies, especially those that they are not particularly diverse, still use this as a mechanism to filter through the people that they come to work at their offices. Therefore, it's not something you should, underestimate. However, I am thinking more about the way we communicate with the people we are building for and with the people we are building with. Architect speak, as they call it, will not only mean very little to the people who are outside our profession, but actually the unintended consequence is that it draws a line between them and us. And when you are trying to lead a team, that's not very helpful. And also when you are trying to seek opportunities to progress your career as you move forward in directions that, that they are a little bit more alternative, is not helpful either. My first job in the UK was at a company that designed and built high-end domestic projects, and where the joiner was as much a colleague of mine as an architect was. There I learned that on site they did not care about the concepts. They couldn't care less. They only cared that the drawings they received could be printed on site and that they had clear notes to build from. It was very, very humbling for me, having come from the university and the idea that we were there to tell them what they had to do. Years later, I have developed like different tips to overcome this barrier and to facilitate the communication within the team. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this as the last point is so that it is maybe better remembered. I think it is important, especially when you are coming from a diverse background or you are minority within the construction industry, that you feel comfortable and confident in the role you are trying to do. And so having the rest of the team on your side is super helpful to reduce any anxiety, give you confidence and help you, do your best, essentially. So if I were you, I would always be mindful of the other person.
Got about 10 seconds left,
Sorry.
Cristina.
Sorry, work on your empathy. And well, you can read the screen, but also very importantly, listen to what is not being said to understand what you could do better so other people are actually welcome to the table.
Thank you, Cristina. Very, very insightful. And I'll probably ask you a couple of questions in the Q&A. Our final speaker this evening is Paul Karakusevich. Paul is an architect and founding partner of Karakusevich, Carson and Partners. I believe he's still also one of the Mayor of London's design advocates, advising the GLA on how to deliver better buildings and environments. I requested Paul to join us today because I know that he's very active in supporting, mentoring, and working with young people who aspire to become architects. And I think it's really important to hear from a practitioner's perspective. So over to you, Paul.
Right, a bit of background initially, especially for the students on the call. Like I said, Paul Karakusevich, founding partner of Karakusevich Carson Architects. Seems a very long time ago now, but I graduated from the Royal College of Art in 1995, probably before most of you were born. And I've worked after the RCA. I was very, very lucky. I managed to get a job with Zaha Hadid when there was only, I think, 8 people in the studio at the time. She had just won a big competition and she was looking for Part 2 grads, and I was luckily the one they picked. Did that for a year and a half, got a little bit fed up, went to work for another competition studio, Matthew Priestman Architects, and then sort of a year and a half after that, decided to set up a practice to do public work, and especially public housing, and that's what really we've been doing for the last 15 to 18 plus years. I think we thought we were going to win the next huge opera house or museum or art gallery, but while we were doing that, we were also entering competitions for housing in Europe, probably when not many other people were doing that in the UK, and housing wasn't particularly fashionable at the time. Public housing was almost unheard of. Social housing not really been discussed for about 30 years. And gradually started to win competitions and started to create a portfolio in that sector, and built from there really. Over the time, since setting up, obviously built a moderately sized practice. We've just gone over 100 people now in the studio. And 99% of the office is working on public work for 20 local authorities and city councils in the UK, and we have one private client and over 98% of the fee income for the practice is public funds. So when Femi and Lucy invited us to do the talk a few weeks ago, obviously we're normally talking about housing, and it was an interesting invite. I've been actively involved with the Stephen Lawrence Trust and the Blueprint for All charity for about the last 10 years, been a patron and trustee for the last 4. And this is obviously the barriers and overcoming barriers is a huge issue. I think obviously the Ibrahim and Tumpa and Cristina have spoke incredibly eloquently about those, and I sort of focus most of our talk on overcoming some of those barriers and what we can do as a practice to help. So this is some of my thoughts on the barriers from personal experience, but also research with the trust, and also an open call to the office a couple of weeks ago to ask for their ideas. Some of which there's clearly some overlap with previous presenters, so I won't go through those again. But I think historically it was always seen as a middle class pursuit, elitist, essentially a gentleman's club. Obviously not everyone is from that background. I'm certainly not, and obviously that is one of the key barriers. I think for me, my window into architecture and design came through design and technology. I think over the last 4 or 5 years, design and technology is being eroded from secondary school curricula, which is for me an absolute travesty. And obviously, if you're not totally gifted in art at A level and you can't do design and technology at school, then obviously it's very hard to start thinking about a design or an architectural degree course. Obviously, lack of understanding of what architects do. If your parents don't know one or haven't been open to these subjects, obviously it's very hard. For many, it's not seen as either a realistic career, or one that pays enough money, or is not seen as one that is open. And I think career advisors generally are at school really do not understand what you'll do or want to do. I think one of the big issues for me is the length now. I was very lucky. I studied when there were student grants and scholarships. Now the thought of paying £10,000 a year for fees for 7 years or 5 years of education is crazy, and I think the RIBA really needs, and the universities really need to start to reduce that course length, which I'll come on to in a second. And I think overall time frames, between 7 and 10 years to qualify, and then obviously enter into a practice, age 24 or 25, and then have to in a way relearn everything is obviously not particularly appealing to many people, and you can understand from Ibrahim's slides exactly why people are falling out. So I think a huge shift that many of you may not know about was in 2012 and 13 was the Social Value Act, and a really key piece of government policy to start to introduce, to try and get investment in local communities through major projects that were being commissioned, and one arm of that is obviously the money spent on consultants in the public sector. There's now an obligation through procurement to spend some of that fee income on social value, and I think that is something that can help both people in the communities that we're generally working in explore design and built environment professions as a course, but also open them up to exposure of major, for example, regeneration or infrastructure or change in their communities. As a practice, I think for probably 8 or 9 years we've been actively involved in this, and for me it's one of the most exciting aspects of what we do as a so just covering here again, sort of helping with education, getting people from generally the housing estates that we're working on, broadening opportunities, helping with careers advice, helping with applications to universities, and then also mentoring students through especially through their Part 1 degrees, giving them obviously real world experience. I think it's fair to say over the last 2 years, universities have struggled for obvious reasons. And we get very regular calls from people asking for just a bit of advice and some mentoring, either through Blueprint for All or other educational charities. But I think a real barrier is that it's just the length, and definitely something that needs to be. I think exposure. We're very lucky. We're working in the public sector. We have incredible office space. Obviously, not all architect studios look like this, and not all practices are doing the sort of work we do. But I think it's absolutely key for especially Part 1 degree students to get out, A-level students to just see what potential opportunities there are within architectural practices, and as Cristina mentioned, in other sectors as well. It's the sort of thing that many university tutors do not know about and can't offer, but through social value and widening opportunities, then obviously it's something we can help with. Something I've always been a huge, understanding the hardship issues that many students are going through. We've set up a program with the RCA, a hardship scholarship for students at the RCA, and through the Blueprint for All and various other social value programs we run. I would say tens and tens of students now are studying. We're getting assistance to study, whether it's a full bursary or part of their fee cover or part of their living allowances are paid for either by the practice or by a Blueprint for All, that's obviously one of the overcoming one of the key barriers to progression through the Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. Profile, start very young. This is an example on our South Kilburn projects where in collaboration with Cotter of Vermilion, we're designing a school and some new replacement affordable housing with the council, starting in the local school, talking about the built environment, talking about design, talking about architecture. Slightly older school students. This is with Neil Pinder's incredible group and a group of students from South London, including the Waverley School. So this was in our old factory in Bermondsey. All about measuring and observation with a group of lower sixth form students. Something we really thoroughly enjoyed, these sort of workshops with Neil's groups, and sort of the coverage he's creating now, the network he's made over the last 10 years is incredible. Sahana, one of our senior architects in the practice, up in Balhul, was a traineeship through one of our projects for Haringey Council, the Selby Urban Village and the Selby Centre. So he worked with us for 6 months while he was at the end of his A-level studies. This is on Broadwater Farm. Again, working with a young persons group on the estate, and working with them on workshops, designing everything from buildings to landscape, public realm, play, quiet space, sports spaces, and also discussing what the future homes may look like. And again, this has led to employment for several people, both in the architectural world and media and film and photography and other aspects of our creative industries, which we've again sort of supported, working with Haringey, the design team, and others to really enable as many opportunities as possible and help overcome the barriers. This was with Neil Onion's Beyond the Box consultancy, working with young adults around the estate. And then moving into practice, how can we help part one's sort of year out students, part two and part three. So we run really thorough weekly technical sessions, CPDs, mentoring, training programs from everything from illustration, Revit, 3D model making, workshop, history, culture, theory, programs that Mike, our historian, and the senior team organise for the generally the younger part of the studio, just so they are as well-rounded, technically adept, and trained up as possible, and often filling in some of the gaps that obviously left post university. And final plug. I think probably Femi is going to nudge me in a second. So maybe hopefully you can see that our new book, Public Housing Works, is just being published, and talks about a lot of the work of the studio. Not necessarily a monograph, but a publication on the process of what we do as a studio. And yeah, very open to any questions anyone may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. As always, the consummate professional, you did it with 30 seconds to spare. So brilliant. For all of those, all four of you that have given your fantastic speeches, it's quite interesting how the issues, you know, they run through all four of your presentations. You know, the socio-economic barriers, the cost, the representation, and then the nurturing. And you know, I suppose my first question, and maybe since you're still on screen, Paul, do you feel the situation is getting better as we're coming out of COVID, and on the back of the issues that happened, you know, a couple of years ago in America?
Wow, that's a hard one, Femi. I think if it wasn't for university fees, it would be a lot easier. I think graduating right now in architecture or any allied design industry with £100,000 worth of student debt is for me the massive barrier. I think post George Floyd, I think obviously people have woken up. A lot of people were really not thinking about these issues for well, again, previous discussions, you know, ever. It just wasn't on the agenda, wasn't really on the RIBA's agenda, wasn't on anyone else's agenda. I think clearly it has to be now, and it is. I think for young practitioners, there are more opportunities now than maybe 2 or 3 years ago. There are still multiple barriers to setting up a practice, and all of the reasons that Tumpa described. You know, for anyone setting up in practice, it's a crazy proposition, I would say, financially crazy, and you don't do it lightly. I think there are, because of social value, because of procurement policy slowly changing, there are now more opportunities than definitely 5 years ago for any young emerging practice, and it's the only way we can change the nature of the worlds we operate in, is through, you know, that people have to make a stand, and it'll probably take 3 or 4 years for it to become more sophisticated and the selection process to become more sophisticated. But the statistics of, I think, 1% of all architects being from a black origin is a terrifying figure. You know, I think the London statistics are much greater. I think it's probably 25 to 35%. I would imagine. So for architecture to be down at 1% is slightly terrifying. There's clearly a huge amount of talent coming through the architecture schools and, you know, working in practice, and obviously there's a lot of ambition and a lot of people want to now start setting up. So I think I am optimistic, but it's, you know, it's incredibly, you know, there's still lots and lots of barriers, and it's still a real challenge.
Thank you. I'm coming to you, Tumpa. What are your thoughts on this? Because your presentation kicked off the debate.
Yeah. Well, so Fame collectives started during that time of what you're discussing, of awful events in America, and we started nearly 40 years after, you know, feminist groups in the UK, you know, and I think the main difference is that people are talking about it more. I'm not quite sure if anything has changed that much, but we'll only find out, you know, next few years when we have more data, and to see if talking about it had a knock-on effect or not on how people behave, whether the systemic issues are changing or not. But I do think that the more we talk about it, the more it will be in people's minds, and change will happen, but slowly. But it has to happen. It has to come. Yeah, but I haven't seen any evidence of things changing just because of what happened in last 2 years ago, apart from the fact that it's more in people's radar and we're talking about it more.
Okay. I'm going to come to you, Cristina. I'm going to leave you, Ibrahim, till the end. But you're I dare I say, you're a practitioner. You're the sort of small practice that should be trying to get good, you know, good projects through the public sector. How are you finding it?
We are not even trying. So we are just dealing with private clients, because I'm not even certain where to start, to be honest with you. I mean, the past couple of years, there have been several kind of forces pulling in opposite directions. So you've had, on the one hand, a bit more awareness about diversity. On the other hand, you've had a bit more awareness and kind of will to actually do something about it in the context of sustainability and the environment. And on the other hand, you have Grenfell and the insurances and all the other additional kind of commonsensical rules that they have been coming as a result of Grenfell. And so in a way, those pressures are pulling in opposite directions. And whereas people are trying to, on the one hand, you have many companies, many insurers, etc., you know, no longer insuring certain type of companies. So I just got the letter from my insurer telling me that I have to sign a paper saying I will never do any projects of, say, 6 stories or over 20 meters in height. Just as an example. So when you start looking at these kind of setups, there is no way that you can look at certain things. Unless you don't want to sleep at night. So I think realistically, there has to be something else that provides some sort of opportunity, almost like a collective opportunity to come under some sort of formula that covers all these kind of insurance and risk, etc., for the smaller companies to be able to access those kind of projects, because otherwise you don't sleep at night, essentially. And I don't think, I mean, whatever the news say and whatever the theory is, the reality is that the forces are pulling in different direction, at least in what I have seen.
Thank you. So Ibrahim, you were in private practice for many years, and you've moved over, and now you're working for the public sector. How are you seeing it as someone who has had an incredible journey. You've made it. You know, are you seeing smaller practices coming through? You're looking to find opportunities to give them work, or as Cristina is saying, that there are forces that actually prevent them even applying for this for projects?
Yeah, I mean to be frank and to be honest, we're not seeing small practices coming through, small diverse kind of led practices coming through. And I think the major kind of barrier to that is a lot of local authorities, they have kind of criteria set up to kind of only kind of accept work from the larger practices. And a lot of that, I guess, is kind of from the public sector point of view. It's public sector money, so a lot of it is kind of wanting to be sure that the projects are given to the hands of those who, you know, have experience and who will, you know, almost certainly deliver a good project. I think it's a real shame, really, because it doesn't give these smaller talented practices the opportunity to really shine and get their foot in the door. So yeah, a major problem.
Okay. I'm going to take a question that's been posed, and it's to do with salaries of Part 1s. Over the last, I don't know, few years, I mean, I'm going to talk about myself. I remember my first I remember going for a job as a Part 1, and I worked out that I could earn more in McDonald's than working for an architectural practice. I did not have a trust fund, so needless to say, I did not take that job, and I did something else until I could find one that could pay. We're in 2022, and we still are having to deal with these things. Thank you, Lee, for coming online. Maybe you want to ask your question rather than me read it out.
Yeah, sure. So just a bit of context, I'm a Part 1 with a fair bit of experience. I'm doing my Part 2 through the RIBA Studio program. So I work full time at the same time. But many of my colleagues at Part 1 level, and it's widely reported that a lot of Part 1s get paid less than the real living wage, work in RIBA chartered practices, whom as a RIBA chartered practice have a commitment to pay at that level at least. There are also Part 2s that have experience that are still getting paid less than that level. Do we think that RIBA are doing enough to combat that, given that, you know, it's their principles that they've set out, and there are many RIBA chartered practices that aren't committing to that?
Before I ask the panel, Adrian, are you still online?
Hi, Femi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Adrian. Thank you very much for joining. I mean, it's a question which I thought would come up, so I'm grateful that you're here, because I can give the emotive response, which is that no chartered practice should be doing this, and I know that there are many firms that stick by the rules of being chartered, but it's still an issue. So maybe you could just offer up something here and just give the RIBA's view from the horse's mouth, as it were.
No, sure, Femi, and good evening, everybody. Thanks for inviting me along to listen to the debate. I mean, yes, I mean, so Femi and I did share some statistical data before this event. So as you're aware, I mean, there is no doubt about what the chartered practice requirement is. All RIBA chartered practices are required to pay the real living wage as set by the Living Wage Foundation, and it's fairly crude. There are only two rates. One is within London and one is outside the rest of the UK. And that's a chartered practice requirement. Now, it's difficult to get absolutely accurate data because, of course, there isn't an obligation on practices to publish salary data, and there are different surveys that the AJ has done. But what Femi and I have been looking at is actually the business benchmarking survey, which is completed by the chartered practices themselves. And there is indication in that a certain proportion of Part 1 students are paid less than the living wage, because you can look at the lower quartile figure, and the lower quartile figure, that's obviously the 25% of the number in that sample are being paid below that figure. And so, for example, it depends how you cut the data. If you cut it regionally, there are 3 RIBA regions where the lower quartile figure for Part 1 students actually reported is lower than the living wage. I suspect if you cut it by smaller practices as well, you'd get a similar picture. So there is evidence, hard evidence that it's below. I guess the difficulty is you have to bring that evidence to the RIBA, and it's actually getting that to come forward that has been the difficulty, I think, in the past. The difference now, though, is that the professional standards team at the RIBA, it used to be that to bring a complaint against any practice or member, you had to have a complainant, and I suppose there are some reasons for doing that, but on instances where the RIBA now believes there's grounds to raise a complaint against a chartered practice, it doesn't necessarily have to have a named complainant anymore. The standards committee can take up that case on the basis that they are in possession of sufficient evidence. So that should mean that hopefully people feel more confident about coming forward. And contrary to what is written in the press, the RIBA does always pursue these cases, and it even pursues cases of advertised jobs. And if you follow the AJ, you'll have noticed there was a practice in the last couple of weeks where they eventually withdrew a job advert as a result of sort of some of the publicity around that. But we would always pursue it. But there's no doubt that the problem still exists. There isn't so much evidence at Part 2, although you have to caveat all of this by saying the real living wage is not a huge amount of money. It's around about 19,000 and something for outside London. Does that help, Femi? I don't want to say too much.
Yes, it does. I mean,
that's the kind of more factual side of it, as you say.
I mean, thank you for providing those numbers. I suppose one question I do have is, what happens if the practice is not chartered?
Well, it's important to say, so for charter practices, it's a charter practice requirement, and they can be held to the code of practice. It's important to point out, though, that 2 years ago, that was extended into the code of professional conduct as well. So even if a practice isn't an RIBA chartered practice, if there is an RIBA member that is a director of that practice and part of the decision making and management of that practice, then they could also be liable under the code. So it's not only a protection to chartered practice, although, I think you should have greater assurance if somebody's seeking. I think it's possible that somebody could, potentially argue as an individual they weren't aware of the code. I don't think there can be a chartered practice really that isn't aware of its obligations under the code of practice. They must be.
Adrian, can I just ask from a point of view, what is the consequence to a RIBA chartered practice? If somebody made this complaint and it was found to be true, what would be the consequence for that practice?
Well, the ultimate sanction that the RIBA can take against any member or practice if they're subject to a complaint ultimately is expulsion from the RIBA. I mean, that in the end is the only sort of ultimate measure, and you would lose your chartered practice accreditation, and you potentially might find yourself outside of the RIBA, and it would be up to the appraisal or hearing panel to make that decision. What has happened in the past, I mean, and this is a more difficult area, is in the past when we've had people that have been reluctant to raise it, we have brought it to the attention of practices and reminded them of their code obligations. So a good example of that is we have had, it varies, but some of the professional studies advisors in the schools of architecture are quite good on this, and we've had professional studies advisors raise concerns with us and asked us to speak to practices, so we can do that as well. But I think I guess it's the same as the bigger picture issues that you're talking about here. You need both systemic change and cultural change, and I think just listening to the conversation and what you were saying before, I think there may have been the beginnings of some cultural change on the barriers to architectural education, but let's be frank, very little systemic change, because the ARB controls the process ultimately, and we haven't seen any reform of architectural education beyond the apprentices, which has been a really positive step forward. But beyond that, the very rigid 3-part structure, the requirement to do a ARB prescribed exam at part 1 if you don't have a part 1 but you've got a part 2, the 7 years, which is probably 10 years in reality for most people, they're still very rigidly adhered to, and that hasn't changed. I think with the charter practice, we've got the opposite. You've got a structural change. There's no lack of clarity about what's required of the practices, but it's getting the cultural change that people, abide by it and recognise they've got to do it. I would say that my personal experience, and it was really down to Angela Brady during her presidency, the one area where probably the RIBA can point to a success is the resistance of the internship culture. I mean, that was very much in the ascendancy at the end of the last recession, and the RIBA did make a stand on it. And I think that cultural change did happen. You don't get a lot of internship sort of, what should we say, malarkey going on within architectural practices. And it was, there was a real attempt to get it going at one time. So I think we've just got to get the same move. I mean, you've then got this, and I don't want to go into controversial areas, but you've then got the more controversial aspect, which is, of course, if you set the living wage, but you're asking people to constantly work very, very long hours, are you really paying the living wage? And that's an even more complex issue, I suspect, but so there's that cultural change to go.
Thank you, Adrian. Can I just ask any of you if you've got anything to add to Adrian's very detailed response? Let me just ask Paul first, as a practitioner and someone that employs, a number of, dare I say, part 1s and part 2s and 3s.
We've got a small number, I think, probably 3 or 4 part 1s in the office at the moment, probably 15 part 2s at various stages. We pay the living London wage, I think as described by the mayor, and I forgot the exact figure. I think it went up fairly recently. And part 2s, I think it's a lot more than it used to be. Let's put it that way. I've gone probably £29,000–30,000 now for an average part 2 joining the practice. We are also looking at a hardship allowance as well for part 1s, especially who may need that extra bit of help and maybe don't have the bank of mum and dad to help them move to London, or survive in London on that type of salary. So we're looking at that as well, again, to avoid that attrition through the various stages.
Thank you. Ibrahim, I mean, your journey's, is quite charted, and I wrote down while you were talking, what kept you going through the many years of your journey? What was the driver to ensure that you didn't, like some of your cohort, just say, I've had enough of this, I'm going to do something else, and then a million becoming an IT tech man or something like that?
I think for me personally, it was just the way I was raised and a lot of kind of mentorship from my parents, and just having the determination to want to see something through and see it through to the end. And I appreciate that's not going to be everybody's experience. Not everybody will have mentors who can support and give them that drive. And yeah, it's tricky. I think Adrian touched on the thing about systemic change and how long the course is, and also I think Paul mentioned about coupled with the high tuition fees, it's just kind of an impossible situation really, and it's a real major barrier. I think a lot needs to be done to try to actually reduce the length of the course, given the amount of tuition fees that students are having to face today. But yeah, as I say, for me, it was kind of just the personal drive to see it through, and having strong role models and mentors to kind of give me that support along the way.
And Cristina, you obviously studied abroad, came over here, had to prove that your academic achievements were comparable to those here. Do you hold any resentment at having to?
No, because I would get wrinkles and a lot of white hair, and there is no point they will come anyway. No, I think, to be honest with you, I feel I was very misinformed, and I studied way many years than I should have. And essentially, I was told by the course director of one of the universities that I shouldn't have had to spend so many years studying here with the years I had done back home. But at the time when I arrived, I mean, it is, you can only deal with what you have or what you know at that time. So I too had I was working and studying at the same time. And I had to be working on weekends as well as during the week, because the Part 1 equivalent job was very precarious. It was really low pay, and it was in central London. So basically a lot of my money was going into transport. And if I was working over the weekend in a toy shop, I was getting double pay on Sundays. So to be honest with you, it was more profitable than working in architecture. So I think, you can only do, like Ibrahim said, I mean, if you decide that this is your way, you should go ahead. Personally, I even took a little bit of time off to just focus in working and save up some money before I went back to just do the final project, because I needed that. I couldn't, it was a bit too chaotic. And I think this is something, I mean, at the time when I was studying, to be honest with you, not many universities were used to people needing to work. They were assuming you had to be accepting that you were getting into debt. And this is something that culturally not everybody wants to do. So I think the university should make an effort, because, I mean, in my case, it's a family thing, but I know for a fact that certain cultures don't like to get into debt. So therefore, I think universities are not being diverse in the approach of fees, for example. Yeah.
Thank you. And Tumpa, from your research, you've obviously gathered a lot of data, and a number of the women that you've interviewed or are part of the FAME collective, are they finding the level of support, whether it's from the family, in order for them to pursue their dream, or they're just, going on it on their own and just hoping for the best?
We didn't, well, our questions and our discussions only include what the kind of information they want to reveal. So we have these sessions where people come with their challenges, and some of the support that they require would be from their home or in education or in employment. But it's a combination of all three, I guess, where they find it difficult to get the support to continue. I mean, I can go from my own experience of being a woman of color and studying in London. I haven't really introduced myself properly, but I studied in the UK, and I grew up in Southwark in London. So when I graduated, I was thrilled to get a job in a really big architecture firm in Southwark. But to my surprise, I was one of 4 architects, graduated with Part 3 who are from ethnic minority background, which was in itself was quite a challenge in that culture. So, every time I had been given opportunities or responsibilities, they were taken away by someone else who presented my work in a meeting, or the barriers were very sort of hidden, if you like, or disguised. So I would be doing all this work, leading a package of 40-story tower, external envelope, but I wouldn't be allowed to present it to the client because for some reason I wasn't the right person to represent the firm. I can't turn around and say that is something holding me back, but it did hold me back because I didn't directly experience being in that scenario where you present your ideas, your work, and that's at a level of a professional level. But in terms of when you're a Part 1, I think some of our audience here are from Part 1. When I was doing my year out, I was very naive about what to expect and what kind of experience you should be, driving the firm to give you. And it's only when I did my PDR and my professional study tutor, which you have to pay for, which is ridiculous, you have to pay £250, I think, to get someone to look at your PDR at a, RIBA registered university. It's only then, having that conversation, I was told that I wasn't receiving the right experience at practice. I was doing all front end projects, and in order for me to build up to Part 3, I should be pushing for experience at the later stages of the projects. And when I spoke frankly with the practice I was in, it wasn't received very well. I was somebody who's making trouble. I'm somebody who's demanding too much, whereas the other Part 1s who are white and, it didn't matter whether they're male or female, they were the ones who were given that Part 3 experience, which I was lacking. So immediately that was my barrier. I was held back from trying to embrace the whole system of getting your Part 3 experience, because no matter how loud I shouted, it wasn't easily, it didn't come easily, basically. So yeah.
Did you leave?
Sorry?
Did you end up leaving?
Yes, I did. So that's how I navigated around it, by finding somewhere else where, I was given that opportunity, and able to do my Part 3 and progress with my career. So there are, various layers of support that your initial question was about support, wasn't it? So to respond to that, I think that the layers of support that you can get, one of them is from the university, where someone actually told me, because my parents wouldn't know what kind of experience I need, because none of them are architects and I didn't have that background. So I relied on that career advisor to tell me, actually, I'm looking at your PDR and you're not receiving the right experience. So I think it's really important, I think, to go back to Christina's presentation, where she mentions about networking and speaking to other people and understanding, what your next motivation is and how you could reach out for help through people who'd gone through that journey. And that's what we're trying to provide in Fame Collective, that kind of support, that kind of discussion. Sorry, I've gone on for a bit too long, but
okay, thank you for that. So there is a question here that talks about, would it be a hindrance to an architecture career if a break was taken from architecture for a number of years to pursue other aspirations like military service? Well, can I answer that first? So I took 4 years between my Part 2 and my Part 3, primarily because when I got my Part 2 in 1990, we were in the depth of the recession, and I had a young family and a mortgage, and I couldn't afford to do sufficient work experience to do my Part 3, because they were, if you could find a job, they were, employers were exploiting the situation. So I did something else. And actually it made me, I think, by coming out of that environment, it probably made me a better businessman, probably a better architect, actually, because it just led me to explore myself and to understand how to push for things. So yeah, I mean, a career break is great. I keep telling a lot of young people that architecture is a vocation. You either feel it, or you don't. And I believe that some clients, they know that. So you then have to marry this desire to give everything to a client and not expect to be financially rewarded. It's interesting, I gave a talk last week and I said that, if you look at all the top architects in the AJ 100, they're names that you recognize, not only because they're great designers, but because they're also very good business people. Right? You need, an architect isn't just someone who designs all day long. You need to think about the business aspect. Paul, what are your thoughts? Sorry, I'm wittering on here. I'm conscious that we've only got about 5 minutes left.
To Seth's point, I think maybe in the old days, taking 2-3 years out to do something else would have been a delay and may have been frowned on. But I think nowadays it's I think you can take an extended year out or 2 years out, 3 years out, come back, finish off. And I think if anything, it adds interest and variety to your CV and portfolio when you then come in for an interview 3 or 4 years later than maybe your counterparts on your Part 2 course. So I personally don't think it's an issue at all.
We've got about 3 minutes left. There's a question from Dua Ahmed. What can we do to push the RIBA to shorten the course length? Can you do quick suggestions? Compress the academic year? Adrian, you've just come back online.
Well, no, I didn't know it was helpful to make a comment, because, you know,
we are looking at it, aren't we?
Just to say that, you know, ultimately it relies upon the ARB being more flexible. This isn't to sort of bash the ARB or anything, but ever since the RIBA education review, the RIBA has been calling for more flexibility in the course structure and saying that, you know, so what part of the argument is it should be based on academic credits, not years of study, because I think that would provide a huge amount of flexibility. I think there was some views within the RIBA for a number of years that the course length shouldn't be shortened, but I don't think that's true anymore. I think it's been accepted that it's about what's been learned, not the years of study. I think if I was trying to be fair to the ARB, I think part of their problem of the past is that we've been signed up to the EU directive, which is very traditional in that it does base it on years of study, 5 years of study. And of course, the UK has been very tied to the notion that practical training or experience is an important element, which is why you end up with this 5+2. But I mean, the ARB could be more flexible about it. We're quite convinced, and they have got the powers to do so. So really, I think it is for us, you know, not just the RIBA to be lobbying the ARB, but all registrants to be saying to the ARB, you know, we're not going to get change without you moving. And also, I think the other one that is needs a bit of lobbying is there's still this insistence at the ARB that if you come even with an international qualification that's perhaps recognised by the RIBA at Part 1 even, they will insist that you do the ARB prescribed examination at Part 1, even if you complete a UK Part 2. And this just seems a deliberate barrier, really. And of course, it's not a cheap, the examination fee. So not to bash the ARB, but only to explain that the RIBA's power in this is somewhat constrained. It can only lobby and influence, and the way ahead document that was published, you know, does ask for much greater flexibility. It doesn't state that there should be minimum years of study. That's not its position. You know.
Thank you. So we've got about a minute left. I'm just going to quickly go around. If I could ask each of you, you're now qualified architects. If you were looking at your undergraduate self and you could give yourself a piece of advice when you come up against a barrier, what would it be? And I'm going to go around on my screen. I'm going to start with Cristina, then I'm going to Ibrahim, and then to Tumpa, and then finally to Paul.
Lucky me. It would be to ask more questions before you accept any answers. So basically get more involved in networks and actually find out deeply whether you are being presented with the right information.
Thank you. Next.
So mine would be, it's quite similar to Christine's, mine would be to find a mentor and to kind of put yourself out there. Because for me personally, I found in my career when I've got across barriers, it's often helped to speak to people who are quite knowledgeable or who have, you know, experience in the profession and who have been able to offer support. So my advice would be to find a mentor.
Thank you. Tumpa?
Yeah, I agree with Cristina and Buhari, and I would recommend you join a platform like Fame Collective, because through that we could find the right support for you. You don't have to join Fame, but there are lots of different ones that could be applicable for you. So yeah, and also really increase your skills as much as possible, because architecture education opens doors to so many different professions and disciplines. So be open-minded about that.
And finally, Paul?
I think for me, you can probably tell by my lack of technological skills, get as fluent as possible in all of the drawing and model making skills as possible, not just beautiful sketches and model making, but using technology as much as possible, software and drawing software and everything else. And I think it's something that probably tutors won't talk about as much, but by the time you graduate, you really need to be able to use software fairly fluently. I couldn't. I always missed it at school and then at degree and then at master's level. Graduated still using an old-fashioned mainline drawing board, and within 1 year, all of the new people at Zaha's were being hired with computer skills, and I realised it was time to move on and pretty much set up fairly quickly. So I just come out as fluently as possible with every single drawing, model making, spatial skill you can.
Thank you all. And you know, I'm going to second that. It's always about trying to get a foot in the door with a practice, and sometimes it could be just as a model maker. I remember I got my first real job by saying I could use CAD. I couldn't. I bought the book on as I was leaving the interview because they said I was starting on Monday, and I spent the next 48 hours trying to work out how this thing worked. But it was fine because the guy that employed me knew absolutely nothing. And in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So sometimes you do also need to fake it. Anyway, everyone, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your presentations. For those of you that have been listening today, thank you. I hope you've taken something away. There will be more Future Architects events, so please look on the website and look at the Instagram. Once again, thank you very much. Good evening and good night.